Welcome to the Legal Academy, Episode 9. I'm your host, Orin Kerr. This is an unusual week in that there's no guest, or maybe a way of thinking about it is that I'm the guest. This is a week about questions and answers. I received a bunch of really terrific questions from those watching the show, and I asked for more questions on Twitter recently, and so I got a bunch of great questions from you, the audience members, and I wanted to take this week as an opportunity to answer those questions, or at least to offer some thoughts on what the answers might be. To give you an idea of where I'm going to be going, I'm going to be spending a lot of time talking about the lateral market. I've received a bunch of great questions about how does the lateral market work? How do you get hired from one school to another? And then also some really good questions about law school teaching. I've not talked a lot about teaching, and I first want to talk about why I haven't been talking about teaching as much, and then also offer some thoughts on teaching. And that'll occupy most of the time of the show. And I wanted to start with kind of a meta question that I got from a viewer, which was, what's the audience of the show? What's the point? What am I trying to achieve by having this show? And so I want to talk a little bit about kind of what I'm trying to do. The way I see it, being a law professor is an amazing job. We're just incredibly fortunate to have this job. And part of that is because the teaching loads for law professors in the United States tend to be low. The tenure rates tend to be high. Once you have the job, it's kind of an amazing, as Dan Markell once put it, a loophole on life. It's just an amazing position. And what that means is that there's a lot on the market. There's a lot about how to get an initial entry-level teaching job. And then tenure standards are pretty low, so most people will get tenure. And then there's this question of what happens next. How do you define yourself as an academic? And how do schools that consist mostly of tenured professors, how do they define themselves as an institution? And there's no right or wrong answers to these questions. There are all these just issues of self-definition and how should we think about these things, and what are the different ways that we might approach scholarship, how might we approach teaching, how might we approach service, all these questions about what kind of academics we want to be, how do we want to do our jobs. There's no right or wrong answer, and once you have tenure, you more or less can't be fired. So people have decades of their career in which it's up to them to define how they want to do this job. And so I've always been really interested in these questions of how should we do these jobs. And I thought, let's talk to really great people who've thought a lot about these issues and who have had marvelous successes themselves, and get out the different ways of thinking about it. So my goal in having this show is to bring out different perspectives on how to do this job. That was the goal. It was really an audience of law professors that I had in mind. My recent Twitter poll suggests that the audience is actually mostly people that are interested in becoming law professors, or law students who want to know kind of what's the deal with my professors, like who are these people and how do they think. So the audience is less the people who have the job now and those that are interested in getting the job. And that makes a lot of sense. I can certainly understand that. But the goal that I had, at least in creating it, was more kind of with the audience of law professors in mind. Okay, let me turn to the question that I've received some good emails about, and that is lateral hiring. So I've talked a little bit on the show about lateral hiring and how it works, but let me offer a big picture perspective, and I'm going to start from the beginning, especially because many people watching or listening are not law professors and have no idea how this works. So let me start from the beginning and offer some big picture thoughts on this. So law schools typically have faculty appointments committees, which are groups of the faculty that are in charge of figuring out who might be an attractive candidate to bring forward for a potential hire. Usually the appointments committee is appointed by the dean. Sometimes it's elected by the faculty, or there's sort of a mix in terms of how they get there. But it's a group of faculty, typically representing different kind of factions on the faculty, different types, areas, fields, and they're all brought together with the task of figuring out who the faculty might want to have come through and be considered for a position. When the faculty appointments committee is formed, sometimes it will have significant input from the dean, and sometimes it won't be. So the question that you have as a candidate is how might you attract the interest of the faculty appointments committee? And I should say, I should have said this beforehand. It turns out this year I am actually on the faculty appointments committee at my home institution, UC Berkeley, and absolutely nothing I'm saying here has anything Berkeley specific in it, or any connection to the institution that I'm currently a part of. In fact, the appointments committee has not done anything at Berkeley, and so I have no idea how things work internally at Berkeley. This is entirely the perspective of first having been a candidate myself, and also having done appointments at other schools. So the goal from the candidate's perspective is to sort of get the interest of the appointments committee. And the appointments committee is going to have some sort of guidance, typically from the dean or from a chair of the committee or something, about what kind of candidates they're looking for. Let's say it might be, for example, subject matter based. It might be a senior basket weaving law professor has retired, and the school really needs somebody to teach basket weaving and the law, and they need someone, and so the appointments committee is tasked with finding somebody to be the new basket weaving law professor for that school. This is obviously a hypothetical example, not a real course, fortunately. But the appointments committee will then be in charge of trying to figure out who's good, who's out there. Now, this is the interesting question. How does an appointments committee typically do that? Well, usually they will consult with members of the faculty that teach in that area. So they will, for example, let's say basket weaving law is a 1L course, and so there will already be 3 or 4 people on the faculty that teach that class regularly, and the appointments committee may consult with the appointments committee may consult with the current professors who teach this and say, who's good? Who should we think about hiring? Who's a leading basket weaving law scholar? And that will lead to the creation of a couple of names of people to consider. The appointments committee may ask people sort of recognized as leading people in the field at other schools, who's good. And so there's sort of usually the creation of a list of here's a bunch of people who we should take a look at that are potential hires. At that point, usually the school will contact people who are on the list and say, would you like to be considered? The exact timing of when the school will contact the potential candidate varies, but there's oftentimes a preliminary inquiry just to say, hey, are you interested? Because from the school's perspective, they want to make offers to great people who may come. So they need to know who's actually interested in making a lateral move. And so candidates will sometimes they are very interested. Sometimes they say, I can't. I have kids in school, or they're just very happy where they are. And so that's obviously going to be candidate specific. But the schools will make inquiries into who's interested, and then that will lead to a smaller list. And then typically they will read the work of the potential candidate. They're going to inquire into, basically figure out whose work is really good. And so they're going to read it themselves, or they're going to seek reviews. Sometimes they'll be internal reviews. Sometimes they will be external reviews, that is within the school or at people at other schools. But they're trying to just figure out who's the leading scholar in this field, or who's a significant scholar who we can hire, who's an up-and-coming academic or an established academic, just someone who's really excelled, who we may be able to lure from their current institution. Now, a couple things about that. One is that it's mostly scholarship based, and so schools may be interested. The schools vary in terms of how much they care about how good a teacher a lateral hire is. But typically, when they're looking to fill a spot, they're focused on who's the top scholar who we can attract in a particular area. And then another thing about that is they're inevitably asking the people who they know, people at their school or maybe a few people at other schools, who themselves may not have a completely unbiased perspective about the field. So it'll often happen, I'm going to stick with my basket weaving example. In the school will ask the professors at who teach basket weaving law at the school who's good, they're going to probably know mostly about people who've written work similar to theirs or co-authors on case books or articles, and so they're going to have their own kind of limited view of the world, and that can lead to a problem which we talked about, I think, in the Eric Posner episode, of schools sort of replicating themselves within fields. So, if basket weaving law is divided into different schools of thought, you might have a school that focuses on one school of thought because when they ask the people who are currently on the faculty who's good, they will recommend people who are also part of that school of thought. And unfortunately, that can lead to a lack of breadth in coverage, and that you can have sort of great people who aren't in that specific style of approach to the field who are overlooked because they're not sort of coming to the mind of the folks who are already at the school. But the appointments committees will try to generate a list of the top people, read their work, figure out who do we think is really good, and then they'll try to invite those people in for an interview. And at that point, it actually becomes a lot like the entry-level process. A person will come in for a day-long interview. They'll do a job talk. The faculty will figure out, what do they think of the job talk? What do they think about the candidate? And give feedback to the appointments committee. The appointments committee will then vote and say, who do we think who seems to have the support of the faculty, who should be brought forward for a full vote of the faculty, and then that goes to a faculty vote. And some faculties defer a lot to the appointments committee. They figure the committee has looked really closely at this. At other schools, there's almost like a de novo inquiry. They really don't care what the appointments committee has done. They want sort of how is the faculty going to approach this candidate each time anew. But that's roughly how the process works. Appointments committees tend to change year to year. So from the candidate's perspective, sort of each year is almost a new year. And this matters a lot, in part because lateral hiring can take a long time. This is a big difference between entry-level hiring and lateral hiring. Entry-level hiring happens on a fairly set calendar. You have the year starts, there's the AALS meat market, not meeting this year because of COVID, but in every other year, that's how it would work. And then you have callbacks based on a certain time, and it all sort of follows a certain schedule. That's not how lateral hiring works, because there's no one moment when everyone's focused on this candidate. Instead, it's individual schools looking at individual candidates. And the process of being hired at the lateral level can be something that happens over multiple years. You might have somebody who is considered 1 year, and then the candidacy is paused for a bunch of reasons, and then next year is picked up again. A third year is considered, an offer comes out, then the person comes the fourth year, or maybe delays for a year, and it's the fifth year. So it's a long, drawn-out process. Patience is unfortunately required, typically, to go through this process. It can take a long time, and because appointments committees change year to year at most schools. Sometimes it's a 2-year appointment, sometimes it's a 1-year appointment. It sort of varies, I think, institution to institution. It means that you can have a situation where you're a great candidate for one committee, but then the next committee isn't that excited, and your candidacy sort of goes down for reasons completely out of your control. Or the opposite. It could be the next year you have a committee that is particularly well suited to your interest and your approach, and so it's just there's a lot of randomness in the process, and that's actually something that I think is important to flag for all of this. I mean, all of legal academic hiring has a heavy randomness component. It is not predictable, but lateral appointments is, I think, much less predictable than entry-level appointments. With entry-level appointments, you have everyone, all the different schools that are hiring that year, looking through the book that is created by the AALS for this purpose, and schools are sort of, everyone's looking and everyone's sort of interested to know who else is interested in a particular candidate. It's all sort of this focus, and it all has a very specific time frame that sort of focuses the schools and says who's in contention and who's not. Lateral appointments is each school acting individually, typically without a sense of other schools necessarily looking at that person. Maybe they have a sense, and it certainly helps the candidate if there is a sense of other schools also looking, to develop a little bit of a competition there. But typically it's one-to-one. There's no pressure in terms of we need to hire this person right now or else we'll miss our chance. And that means that there's just a lot more randomness built into it. I think also just because senior professors will have a fuller body of work and a fuller reputation, and faculties will often divide on what they think of that person's work or that person's reputation. Entry level, everyone sort of comes in on the blank slate, and you can say, oh, this person has done 3 articles, read the 3 articles, and that's like the entire world of that person's work. If somebody has 10 or 20 or 30 articles, there's just sort of more to disagree on. So lateral hiring tends to be, I think, less. It can take longer. It's sort of more random in terms of whether it works out at a particular school than even entry level appointments, which itself can be pretty random. So two more parts of this that I think are worth talking about. One is the role of visiting professorships, something that I talked about in the episode with Sarah Losky. So traditionally, a lot of law schools required a visit before they would consider a lateral candidate. And so this would be a so-called look-see visit, and that would be they're looking at you to see if they want to hire you. And a look-see visit is different from a so-called podium fill visit in that it comes with appointments committee interest. The appointments committee has decided they are interested in the candidate, they want to hire the candidate or want to look into hiring the candidate, and then as part of the school's process, they will say, we have a visit requirement or strong preference. And so the dean will then invite the person to visit with the understanding that while they are at the school, they are being considered for a job, they will have the opportunity to do a job talk, and they will be considered for a position. Oftentimes the actual consideration will happen the next semester once they're back at their home institution, but it's at least they will be considered for a position during the visit. And that's distinct from a podium fill visit, which is just there's a course that needs to be taught at the school. They need someone to come and teach the class. That doesn't come with appointments interest. They just need a professor to handle that course. And if you're the potential candidate, you certainly want to know, is this a look-see visit or is this a podium fill visit? Because they're very different from an appointments perspective. And then there's a broader debate that Sarah Losky and I touched on, which is, if you're a potential candidate, do you want to do a visit? Should you do a visit? They're really, really tough on the candidate because basically it's a 4-month job interview or an 8-month job interview if you're there for the year, in which you're being considered for a position. And with families, people have spouses, people have children, people, family. You can't quite just get up and move that easily. So I think there's a trend against having visits as a requirement of being considered for a lateral move. But at least traditionally that was something that was done, and it's something that some schools still continue to do at least often. So that's one thing to consider. The other point I wanted to make, a practical question that a lot of people will have is, okay, that's how the process works. How do I get a school interested in me? Can I just email the appointments chair and say, hi, I'm over here, I'd be interested in coming to your school. Do you want to hire me? So there's common wisdom on this, and I think is mostly right, which is that it usually doesn't work to just contact an appointments chair and say, here I am. And that's true for a couple of reasons. First, the appointments chair may not know who the candidate is or know any sort of reason to think the person is particularly good. And so from the appointments chair's perspective, they may think, well, I want to know someone is thought to be good before we start looking into this candidate. And just a cold call kind of, hey, I'm over here, is not going to communicate that information. So a lot of times appointments committees just don't know what to do with it. And that's putting aside the question they may not actually have interest in a person teaching in that field at this time. There's all sorts of reasons why that usually does not work. What does work more often is instead of calling the committee chair and saying, here, I'm over here, would you be interested? If you know someone on a faculty who would support you and who can raise the question with their appointments chair, that I found, sort of anecdotally, it works more because that comes to the appointments chair not as like someone saying, "Hey, will you please hire me?" It's a colleague of that professor saying, I've heard this person is interested in moving. I know this person is really good. We should consider them. And so that's something which is more likely to generate that appointments interest within a school. And so if you know someone at a school, the way to maybe, tease out, is that school a school that would be interested in me, is to, if you know someone on the faculty, to contact them and see if there might be interest in the school, or let them know that you're interested. With that said, a lot of times the way the process works is it's the hiring school that will make that initial contact of the candidate, rather than the candidate making the initial contact with the hiring school. So at a lot of schools, they'll just this is obnoxious, I'm just telling you how it is, I'm not defending it. They'll kind of assume, like, of course people are interested, or at least they'll take the lead in figuring out who the school is interested in, and then they'll make this inquiry to see with the candidate, is it going to be a waste of our time to consider you? Are you actually interested in joining us? And so typically it will be the school that starts the process. And that's, of course, very frustrating for potential candidates. You might be at an institution and thinking, like, where I am is fine, but I actually don't like the city where I live, or I'd like to be at a different school with a different faculty, or whatever the reasons are that people have to potentially want to change schools. It's frustrating that you can't sort of press a button and say, okay, now consider me. But unfortunately, that's oftentimes the way it works, is you kind of have to wait for the schools to contact you, except if you know somebody who can, and you can sort of float this question of, hey, you think the school might be interested in me. So that's usually how it works. How do you get a school interested? And this is sort of the last question, maybe. How do you get a school interested if you don't know somebody on the faculty, and you're like, hey, I'm over here, and if it's considered a little bit unlikely to work, or even maybe a little bit not rude, just not unlikely to work, to contact the appointments chair, how do you get them interested? This is, of course, the toughest part, and I should say, I was a professor for 16 years and wrote something like 60 law review articles before I received my first lateral offer. So I know this frustration of sitting there thinking, wait a minute, why isn't this working? A lot of professors have this dynamic. What can you do, practically speaking, to be one of the people who's thought of? And so I think there are a couple things you can do. One is, most importantly, write really good scholarship. Write scholarship that is recognized as being good, that people are talking about, that is getting attention within the field. And so when they come to, when the appointments chair comes to schools and says, is who's good, your name will show up. I think that's sort of the direct way of doing it. Also, I think, the more you know people in the field, I think that helps. And also, if there are ways of just letting people know that you might be interested in moving, sort of quietly getting the word out, I think that also can be effective. It just sort of raises the chance that your name will be raised as somebody who's interested in moving. One of the complications here is that schools really don't know who's interested in moving. And so a lot of times schools, the answer for schools is they should just be able to reach out and say, very quickly, like, are you interested or not? But they might feel they don't want to do that. They don't want to get somebody's hopes up or something like that. Or they may feel that people may say they're interested when really they're not interested. It's all it's all a little bit high school like. It's dynamic. If some of this is ringing a bell from many years ago. But that's the tricky question. How do you sort of get yourself on the list? And writing really good stuff is the most direct and important way of doing that. I think going to conferences, being known, speaking well, impressing people is sort of the way of doing it. But I think in general, this is sort of the networking function of going to conferences or something like that, is getting your name out there. If, you want to be on the list when somebody is asked, who's good, who should we hire, and so that's I think the challenge. Okay, I wanted to turn now to teaching. So I've gotten some interesting questions about teaching, and the questions were in part, why haven't we talked about teaching? In which we haven't. We've done a little bit. We talked about course evaluations in the Sarah Losky episode a little bit. But for the most part, I've not talked about teaching. And that's obviously an important part about what law professors do. And so I first want to talk about why I hadn't talked that much about teaching, and then I want to talk about teaching. So why haven't we talked a lot about that? It's hard to talk about teaching for a couple of reasons. One of them being that every professor has their own style, really reflecting their personality of what works well for them in the teaching setting. And it's hard to generalize that. And it's also hard because different topics are conducive to teaching them in different ways. And at different schools, there are different styles that are more or less common or more or less kind of accepted at that school. And so the question of how to teach a law school class is really, it's something kind of so personal or so case specific that it's hard to generalize about. And part of that as well is, I think, trying to figure out who has succeeded in teaching and who has not. That itself is its own challenge. In the Sarah Losky episode, we talked about how teaching evaluations have a lot of problems, especially with respect to race and gender and expectations of students along those lines that make, it's not like you can just sort of go with the numbers and say, oh, this person has good teaching evaluations, therefore they're great. It's hard to figure out who's the most successful teacher or who's the less successful teacher. And especially the way the tenure process works, once somebody's tenured, they're usually not evaluated based on their teaching, at least formally, after that. And so it's something that's actually kind of a hard question to get a handle on and to talk about, I think, because it is so person specific. And here I'll say, you may have a similar experience when you were in law school. Some of you are probably in law school that are watching. Your favorite professor it's usually not like a specific style that you liked. It's that professor. So I think back to my favorite professors when I was in law school. My two or three sort of favorites did not have the same style of teaching. Instead, they had a style of teaching that worked for them. They would present the material in an engaging way and present it in a way that really worked for them based on who they were. And so generalizing about sort of the right way to teach or here's the way to do it I think it's tough. It's like, who are you and how do you want to present it? How do you think of the field? What is the field? Those can all impact how to teach. So that's why I haven't talked about it. Now let me turn to talking about it. I did want to offer at least one way that has worked for me, again with the caveat that this is all idiosyncratic, just my own way of approaching this. In a lot of the courses that I'm teaching, there's a certain amount of doctrinal material. There's like a legal doctrine that I want to cover in a particular class, and I'll break down the syllabus, in terms of different doctrines. And so maybe one class or two classes on a particular rule, or maybe two rules in a particular class. And what I want to do is first present the rules. And so I'll often begin a class with a lecture, just saying, here's the rule. I want everyone to know what the black letter law is. I'm not trying to hide that or anything like that. Just here's the rule, so everyone's on board. And then I want to discuss the main case. There are the main cases, the classic cases, or at least the cases that bring out the nature of the doctrine in the most illuminating ways. And I'll call on students to discuss the case and discuss the reasoning. And often what I'll do then is I'll have the students express a view on whether they think the case is correctly decided or whether they're persuaded by the reasoning of the majority opinion. Let's say it's a case with a majority and a dissent. And I want to ask the student why. I want to get kind of their values, their perspective as to why that's the right or wrong answer. And then I want to get other perspectives there. So the way I think about a lot of law, at least in the classes that I teach, is oftentimes there's a debate of values, different ways of thinking about the world, different ways. Maybe it's based on who we trust or how much we value one interest over another interest. And that then turns into a debate over legal rules. and then the judges typically, since I'm mostly teaching in public law areas, will have a rule that results from that, and there will be the majority rule, and that will fit together with all the different majority rules. And so there's the rule, the doctrine, and then there's the cases from which the rules came, and then there's the underlying debate of values with that sort of clash, which I think explains where these rules came from. So when I'm teaching, I'll usually try to start with a rule, then move into the case that animated or even created the rule, kind of the context from which the rule came, and then I want to debate. So I'll call on that one student about like whether they agree with the rule, and then I'll say who disagrees, and I want to find somebody who looks at it the other way. And of course, this works best when it's a problem of which there's just a clash of opinions. People just look at this problem differently, which I think most interesting areas in law, that's true. And so you'll get two students, and I want them to kind of go back and forth, and I want everyone to kind of weigh in and from all these different perspectives. And then I kind of come in at the end and say, okay, here's the range of views we've had. Here are the values that those are reflecting. Here's what the courts ended up doing because of who was on the court, or for example, at that time, or because of maybe some interesting historical part of it, whatever the particular reason. But I want the students to understand the rule, the context in which the rule arose, and then the debate over the rule. And so I'm teaching typically in classes where I've thought a lot about like where are these rules coming from, how do they fit together, and so I want to sort of you're stepping back and you're sort of going meta basically about that, such that the students will take away the rule, the context of the rule, and then the big debate over the rule, and then fit that together with the rest of the material that you've covered so far. That's what I try to draw out, and part of that is the students that may be having trouble will always get the rule at the beginning. The most advanced students are sort of waiting for the meta debate to happen and hopefully participating in it. But there's sort of something in it for everyone. I'm not hiding what the rule is, but I'm sort of focusing our attention on those debates and then putting the pieces together of tying together the different classes and different materials. That's what I try to do, and this sort of leads to the great cliche of like every law professors, they do a modified Socratic. I also do a modified Socratic, in that the point of calling on students is in part just to get voices talking. I want students sharing their views, because so much of what I'm doing is about a debate over different perspectives. I just needed students active and talking about it. And then, of course, calling on students also creates some incentive to prepare, so you at least know the basic facts of the case. But it's really about sort of getting those voices out there. Okay, so that's teaching. Now I want to turn to, I received some really interesting questions about scholarship for junior professors and how to get started. And the question was framed to me in this way. Should you try as a junior scholar to join a pre-existing debate? Or should you try to start a debate? In other words, when you're trying to think of your first article, should you say, oh, look, here are these bigwig professors and they're talking about this. Let me try to write on that topic and see if I can take a new perspective on that. Or should I find something that no one's writing about, or that is some new thing that people haven't touched on yet, and do that? And so where do you start is sort of the question. And I think, as with all of these questions, there's no one right answer. It all depends on where you think you can have the most impact. But I do think there are some relatively predictable questions you should be asking when you make this decision. The first thing is, do you have something interesting and important to say about the ongoing debate? So you could say, oh, look, the leading people in the field, they're having this debate, and this top law reviews about this. One professor takes that view, another professor takes the other view, and you look at it and you go, I think they're both wrong. I have a third view. First thing you have to ask yourself is this really something that is a new take that is helpful, that will advance that debate? Sometimes it's hard to jump into a debate because you don't have all of the knowledge that leads up to the point of the people that are having that discussion. And if you try to jump in, you might just sort of miss it, right? The benefit of jumping into a pre-existing debate is that there's work done for you in terms of selecting an important topic, right? hopefully the senior bigwig people in the field are having this debate because that's a really critical question. And so you're not going to be wasting your time on something that's irrelevant or easy. And so that's the benefit. And the drawback is, what can you say that's really new about this? In terms of picking a new topic, the benefit is then you don't have like all of the you don't have the problem of what can you say that's new about it, because the whole topic might be new. On the other hand, you have the problem of making sure you found an interesting and important topic. It may be that no one else has written about this issue because there's just not a lot there. And so you might sort of say, hey, I am the #1 expert in this new thing. And then everyone says, well, who cares about that new one thing? And what to make of that, I think, really depends on where you are in your career and how confident you are that the topic is an important one. So if you're an assistant professor, you've already gotten a tenure track job somewhere, and you're thinking, how am I going to, what's the arc of my career going to be? Embarking on a new project where you look at it and you go, I think this is actually really important, and people have, for whatever reason, haven't focused on it, that can be great. It may be harder when you're on the entry-level market if you've got something new, because people may look at what you've written and said, like, well, I don't know what to make of this. This doesn't sort of fit a slot in my mind. Now, you may be somebody who focuses really on a certain methodology rather than an end result, or a doctrinal subject. And in that case, your methodology is really what you're bringing to bear on that, and the particular subject of of the article may not matter all that much. But if you're writing on a particular subject, without like a specific methodology, whether legal history or economics or philosophy or psychology, it may be that writing on something new when you're in the beginning is hard, because people they don't know what this topic is about. They don't know what to make of that. It may be rewarding over time if you can keep building in that field, but it may just be something that's hard to start with. So I guess my overall advice is, when you're starting and you're looking for topics and you're trying to figure out what to write about, you're looking for something new. You're looking for something that is what you can add, something that other people haven't seen or haven't developed in a problem. And a really great perspective on this, I thought, was from Jamal Green in the second show. He had a point about how junior scholars typically are bringing to the debate either sort of doing things that other people haven't had the time to do, more than an entirely new sort of philosophical frame for a problem. So it is very hard when you're a junior person to sort of open up a whole new field and say, here's this new legal theory or something like that. But it is something, if you can find a new problem to bring an existing methodology on, you may be able to find a problem or spend a lot of time working through a problem in a way that others just haven't had the time to do. That can be like a nice first article, a nice sort of way of entering a field and adding value just by virtue of you had the time to work through this problem. And then I think other folks that have found, there may be new issues that are working their way through courts that just professors haven't seen yet, because most professors aren't sort of, I guess the old version would be like reading the slip opinions. There are no slip opinions anymore, but checking Westlaw to see if there are new cases. And so you may be able to find new developments and fit them into prior frameworks. Those are all great. But I think a lot of the process of finding new article topics for a junior, sometimes people say like, oh, this is so hard. I've never done this before. How am I going to sort of find that first topic? To my mind, that is in a lot of ways the challenge of being an academic. Going back to the very beginning of this episode where I talked about how you have this amazing job, you can kind of spend your time how you want to spend it. How you spend it is in part based on the topics that you pick that you think are worth your time. And so figuring out, here's the topic I want to spend time on, is in some ways the most important judgment you make as a professor or a wannabe professor about what it is that the field means to you, or what it is that your academic work means to you. And a law professor, let's say, or a professor who writes 2 articles a year, maybe one long article and one short article, I'm just sort of picking random numbers. The topics of those articles are topics you're going to spend an incredible amount of time with. The writing process, the research process, it just takes so much time. And so you should find something that you think is important and interesting where you feel like I'm really adding something to the debate by writing on this. And so, to my mind, that means you should realize that the process of finding the topic is in some ways as important as what you do once you find the topic. Give that initial finding the topic question room. And often, I think what works is to come up with a lot of different topics. Instead of just being like, I will now spend the month of, what is it, July? I will spend the month of July pondering what is my next article. You might try 5 different things and sketch out, 2 or 3 page introductions of 5 different ideas, and then see which one of them make the most sense, or make them. Or you can even ask a friend, like, which one of these makes sense, or talk to somebody in the field. Try different things, because once you've latched onto an idea, you spend so much time on it, and one idea typically leads to another idea, which leads to another idea. So that time figuring out what you should write about is really, really important. It's not just wasted time. That is kind of, in a lot of ways, that's what we do that is key. Last thing, I received a question in terms of getting help, especially if you're a junior scholar and you're interested in a subject and you want to get advice. Who should you talk to? So the easiest thing to do is to talk to one of your former professors. Email them and say, I'm thinking of becoming a legal scholar and I have this topic. What do you think? And if not one of your professors, a professor at the school where you graduated, or if you're in school now, where you are. And obviously you want to be very, very nice in the email. You're asking for a favor. Would you be willing to offer feedback? But oftentimes somebody at your school should be able to help you. And you can, another approach, which sometimes works, is to just contact people in the field. That usually is a little bit of a mixed bag, because sometimes people in the field will respond. Sometimes people in the field will be super busy. People are generally going to be busy, especially when they're emailed by somebody they don't know, saying, help me. But sometimes that works. And I've tried. Those of you that are interested in Fourth Amendment law, if you email me with an idea for an article, I've promised, I've pledged to respond to that. So those are different ways of doing it. That, in terms of asking for help, though, I think it's a thing to keep in mind. If you can write a request for help that can be answered relatively briefly, that will work better than a request for help that is a big time commitment. So, for example, sometimes the request for help will be, I'm interested in writing on this topic. Here's my idea. Do you have any sort of instant thoughts or ideas for, articles that I should read that are relevant to this? Or does it ring a bell, basically? And this is sort of like a make sure I'm not on a crazy wrong track. And that's something that somebody can write back in 5 minutes, and that's easy. The harder ask is to say, I'm writing on this topic, could we set up a call and talk to me about this? So that's sort of like, that's going to take time, right? You got to do the scheduling, you got to make the call, you got to take a lot of time. And so do the first one, not the second one. That's my recommendation, or you'll get a better response rate if you ask the question, ask for help in a way that can be easily answered. And then sometimes that will lead to more help and a connection. But it's really up to the person writing. They need to, I think it's helpful if you present that in a way that is not putting a big burden on the person you're asking for help. Different case, of course, if you're talking about one of your former professors or somebody you were a research assistant for, or something like that, or you can feel, you can ask for more from someone who you know. But typically, you want to ask it in a way that is going to be a light ask rather than a heavy one. Okay, so hopefully these were useful answers to your questions. Thank you so much for watching and for listening. I've enjoyed these interviews, and I've got we're going to keep doing a couple more interviews on the show. I probably will at least maybe 5 or 6 more, and I might at that point call it off for a while. Call it a season, and then come back to it maybe some other time. But a few more episodes at least planned, and I'm really looking forward to it. And thank you so much for watching and listening.